Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Please welcome Andrew to the stage.
Thank you, Rock. Today's session goes really well. It's a lot of legal bits and pieces addressed in this, so if you have a question during the session, please sing out. I have a lot of slides because I didn't know how long it would take, but the slideshow's there for your benefit afterwards anyway, so you don't have to sort of scribble too many notes. There's a lot of information in there. I'm not going to read from the slide, so I'll just walk through at my own pace, but if you need me to qualify something, please let me know. I'm not a lawyer, so if there's a legal question, I'll have to defer that to great question. I'll get back to you on that answer. So that clear indication I've got no idea what you just asked me, and I'll find out. So part of what Stopline does, and we've been doing for 20 years, is a whistleblower hotline service. And the reason why you're here is because you're interested in understanding what changes in legislation have occurred since July last year. As a result of the changes in legislation, the popularity or the identification of what a whistleblower is has either become clouded or people aren't actually understanding what it is because of the way it's been portrayed. I don't like the term whistleblower myself. It's about a person telling a story, making a disclosure, complaint, responding to a workplace issue. So this presentation and the legislation relates around the protection of the whistleblower. And there's some information about how to make a better workplace culture. ASIC brought out a regulatory guide 270 on the 13th of November, have a seat guys, in 2019, which explains this really, really well. And I've drawn on that. So references are from the regulatory guide that written by ASIC. And I believe they're going to do an update on that regulatory guide as well. So if you haven't read it, 52 pages of really good reading, strong cup of coffee required, but it's got some really good takeaways about putting the information, what to put in your workplace culture arrangements, how to build a better workplace culture, how to create a really good inclusive whistleblower policy and how to implement it, things like that. So off we go. So today, as I went through there, I just wanted to briefly go over the whistleblower laws. It's based on Corporations Act, so there's many laws that interposed in with this, and there's a little bit about the not-for-profit sector as well. That hasn't really been the highlight of the focus of the whistleblower legislation because the not-for-profits, other organisations, education, religious groups, things like that, either tip into the Corporations Act or they don't, or they part tip in there. So there's a lot based on the Corporations Act, but a lot of people are using this as a good governance measure, I suppose. So take away it that, okay, you may not fit the criteria, however, it's probably going to be a good governance issue because they're releasing the new standards, I believe, as a draft late this year, but definitely 2021, sort of June, July 2021. So a lot of it's based on what I'm going to talk about today, which is the whistleblower enhancements for legislation. So part of the information we'll talk about, I won't go to any detail about the fair justice and natural justice, fair treatment, conflict of interest, things like that, because I had to take some of those slides out because it was bordering on like 60-something slides, but I will share them with you after the slideshow, after we've talked today, so you'll get them in the long run. Probably the most important thing that we have to take away from this is the confidentiality and anonymity requirements that you must understand if you're a protection officer, using the legislation term, whistleblower protection officer, whistleblower investigation officer, or a person that has actually been afforded the ability for someone afforded the ability for someone to make a complaint or a workplace misconduct grievance issue or complaint raising to you, because in that case you might actually become the whistleblower itself. So it's really important that people understand the confidentiality, and you can't just go and talk to someone confidentially, because there are ramifications if you identify that person that's made the complaint to you. Did that make sense, or did I sort of waffle on a little bit there? It'll explain it better in this anyway. So the legislation. So the relevant legislation was enacted in 1st of July. The government gave a 6-month leeway, so 1st of January 2020 was the cut-off date. You must have a policy in place. And the amendments came through for the various acts here: Corporations Act, Taxation Act, Banking, Insurance, Life Insurance and Superannuation Industry. Some of those changes came through because of Royal Commissions that came through, people weren't being protected, things like that. It's always been in the Corporations Act anyway, but not to the effect that it is now. So the Corporations Act did have an ability to make a report or a confidential information report under section 1317.
Andrew,
yes?
This apply to all companies?
All companies that have an ability or fall under the definition under the Corporations Act, Taxation, Banking Act, things like that. So at the moment, as it stands, it's large businesses and not-for-profits, which you'll see in a couple of minutes, over a certain threshold. So when you say all businesses, not all businesses, no. But I believe what will be happening in the future is that they're using this as the test legislation backbone, and then it will morph into medium and then small business, things like that. I mean, even as a whistleblower business, I've had a whistleblower policy in place for over 10 years. So I've got my guys have the ability to actually make a report, not to me, but to someone else that they trust and someone else that I've appointed, because even my business with 8, 9 people, I still need to know that people are happy and I'm doing the right thing as an owner as well, and that other people in my business are doing the right thing that we can act on. Yes? No, that's all right.
If a not-for-profit organisation is incorporated, is that being covered under corporation?
It depends. So some parts of it can be, yes, but it depends. And look, I'm not an accountant or an auditor or a legal person. So if you wanted an exact definition of what your business falls under, I would suggest your accountant would know the best answer, whether it fits into the Corporations Act or it does not, or it has some other bearing within the Corporations Act. Rock might be the best person to ask in that respect. Yeah. Yeah.
The Association Corporation Act specifically excludes corporate associations from ASIC.
There you go.
Unless they're a public company, by guarantee, which is ASIC.
Yeah. There you go. Fantastic. Thank you. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Good question, by the way. So the Corporations Act include a regulated entity, which is a company, and I think this will go to somewhat explain what you were asking me, although I couldn't have explained it as good as what was done there. I'll go back a second. So a corporation that may not be registered with ASIC, foreign trading, financial corporations, includes not-for-profit as well. It doesn't really explain your question, but so does your organisation have a whistleblower policy? All public companies that may or may not be listed. Large proprietary companies list 2 of the following. So there's 3 thresholds here: $50 million revenue, gross assets of $25 million or more, or 100 or more employees. So there's your threshold for those acts of corporation, banking, life insurance, things like that. A lot of companies may not have an employee base of 100 people, but certainly fit into the categories 1 and 2. So there's the net. As I said at the start of this, I think it's going to change because it will start to bring that threshold down. Because the government wants to have an all-inclusive workplace and making sure that people behave properly in the workplace. there's a not-for-profits and charities. So there's a small relief to not-for-profits. That is, the company is limited by a guarantee. They have revenue or consolidated revenue financial year of less than $1 million. So the legislation also has some large pecuniary statements made. So you've got to qualify. Now, I know ASIC are actively looking for examples of large companies that may or may not conform to the Act and have a reporting or a function where they've chosen not to have a whistleblower policy, chosen not to have an independent way to actually report the information back into the company. So when we went to a conference last year, Mr Warren Day was saying that once the legislation comes in and 1st of January passes, they're actually actively looking to make sure large companies actually conform with the legislation, and if they didn't, they're actively looking for something to ensure that they did. That statement there at the end of the financial year for the 6 months, they've got to maintain the policy for subsequent years after that as well. These sections they've just been taken straight out of the Act there, so if you wanted to read them in more detail, I've got them on the slide there for you. But section 1317A has those 4 points there. The protections available to whistleblowers, how to make a whistleblower report, to whom the disclosures qualify for protection under the Corporations Act, and they are placed in there and they're written. A lot of people think that workplace misconduct might be a management issue, the way they've managed that person. There's many circumstances that might lead to the fact that it turns into a misconduct issue, which falls under the regulation under the Act. But I know through our service, a lot of the information, if you're going to ask me, does it fall under this Act? A lot of the information, being more than 90%, the answer is no. So a lot of people ring the service thinking that there's a misconduct or is an issue, but it actually doesn't fall under this. So when you're actually going through and receiving information, you have to first qualify, does it fit under the Act, and are they protected under the Act? If they're not, they should be protected under your workplace policies anyway, and there may be other acts of legislation which afford that protection as well. Workplace, touch wood, hopefully Crimes Act, things like that don't come into play, but that's also relevant as well. No, it does not. No. The whistleblower legislation, with the changes that came through, employee, former employee, contractor, subcontractor, partner of employee, a relative of an employee, could be a general public. So really it's a catch-all. And the reason they've done that is because a good example is that you might be affected, but you and I are males and we've got tough skin and that doesn't worry us, even though it does worry us. And your wife has an effect because of something that's happening in your workplace. So your wife might become, or your partner might become a whistleblower because they've made that complaint on your behalf. So they need to have that protection as well, because we get calls where the partner doesn't know they've made that call to stop line. So what that company needs to do then is identify what the information is and act on it, and then also afford the protection for yourself and for your partner to make that.
So basically the piece is through where in your business helping people.
Correct.
People that we help in maybe
Correct. Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. It's not if they're part of another business, and this is where you sort of have to define how you can help them. It's not a misconduct in their workplace, for example. So if you're thinking about a subcontractor or a subcontractor of a contractor, something like that, if it's an issue in their workplace, then they have to have that cover. They have to have the ability to protect that person. But if it's something that's a complaint about your business, absolutely. So yeah, it covers quite a broad spectrum of people now, whereas beforehand it didn't. So. enough to... Okay, so the continuation of that is how the entity will investigate the disclosures. So there's a qualification of how they're going to do it under the Act, how they'll ensure fair treatment. So you've got procedural fairness and natural justice, which must be at play here. How policy will be made available to officers and employees of the entity. Unfortunately, some people use it as a tick box exercise and write the policy and put it on the shelf. I know with my business, I get my guys to actually sign the fact that they've read the policy. It comes back to me, and I continually refresh the policy. Diane, who works with me as well, who's a HR consultant, she helps me do the policy refreshing as well. So I make people actually understand the policy as well, rather than just tick it and put it in the drawer and they not understand that it's been read. And the penalties section, as I mentioned before, ASIC will conduct surveillance activities to ensure the compliance with the obligations and will pursue organisations not complying with the requirements. So that's fairly accurate. I don't have any examples that I can provide to you because the legislation's brand new, but I'm sure that they may conduct them. They did say that late last year that they were going to do those sort of activities. And you can see there, failure to comply with the requirement to have to make available whistleblower policy, 60 penalty units. It's currently $12,600. So I don't have an example of whether ASIC have actually had anything enforced in respect to that, but I know there was a very, very panicked session October, November, December and mid-January, leading up to the 1st of January in my business, where people were making sure that they had a policy in place and were able to report it because of that penalty issue there. So who's responsible? Everyone, really. Everyone's responsible for the policy. And what I mean by that, it's not responsible for writing the policy, it's responsible for understanding the policy, understanding the obligations of the policy, because as I mentioned before, you yourself can become a whistleblower even though you're not a designated person or have been necessarily trained to take a protected disclosure. So what the Act says is, a senior manager should be that whistleblower protection officer. So a senior manager isn't necessarily a senior manager. It should be a senior person in the business that can manage the business and that has some sort of authority to invoke whatever needs to be required in respect to the protection of the whistleblower. So sometimes it's a really tough choice for people to pick out a senior person in a management position within a business, because that poor old person might have to call the shots, if the CEO's been involved or a board member's been involved, and actually stand up against people of that nature and of that position in the business and say, no, I can't tell you these things, or guess what, I'm going to call you out because you actually have done the wrong thing.
So does the Act not specify a level of competence yet for that officer?
Senior manager. So with the regulatory guide, what ASIC have done is write about that. Okay, what does that actually mean? And what it means is having a position of authority within the business. Because I'm sure if they didn't have explained that, me as a senior manager would have got, oh, well, you're the senior manager, you can do that. I may not have the ability to actually call someone out on anything. I may not have the strength or the gumption to actually say to the CEO or the boss, hey, guess what, you've done the wrong thing. Because, as we all know, there are usually different levels of punishment depending on where you are in the business. The more senior, maybe a smack on the bot. Less senior, something a bit more drastic in that respect. So if you're actually going to nominate someone, my advice is make sure they're in the meeting when you nominate them, so it's not a surprise attack on Monday morning. You have to train them, and first and most of all, is that person suitable to that role? Are they going to be able to make that call? And you don't relieve it up to one person. You might have a group of people, 2 or 3 people, where they can manage, because it might be that you need 3 different people or a number of people with different abilities of understanding people's culture, understanding the way people act in the workplace, and they might have three different personalities that people can have a choice to actually come to. I'll have to change your battery, I reckon. So, part of the leadership team and the obligations, you've got to understand how to identify disclosure. So I briefly said about the Act, and it's written in the Act, and it will come up shortly about what is workplace misconduct and what is not. Ensure they have recommend actions for investigation or act upon quickly, because there are some scenarios for protected disclosures where there are actually a time frame, and some of them are 24 hours, so there'll be an emergency time frame where, depending on the type of disclosure that's been made, you actually have to do something, be seen to do something within a 24-hour period, or that person can seek alternative measures. You're going to protect the whistleblower. That's paramount. That's why you're doing it. You know, you want a good workplace culture. Well, I know my guys. I have never done anything wrong, but if I say something or there's a decision I've made, my guys will tell me it's a wrong decision. They got no issues in telling me, nah, we think that's rubbish, or that's no good, or that's a good. So I think I've got a really good positive workplace culture because I'm just a person. I don't have an office. I just sit out with everyone else. And with internal investigations, you've got to have an internal procedure as well. So procedural fairness, natural justice, like I said before, must be at play there. You want to make sure that they're reviewed as well, because you don't want to sort of do the 10-step investigation process and then because you've been nailed to the floor, you can't get past number 8, but your procedure says you'll do number 8, but you can't. So my advice is, when you're writing internal procedures about investigations, don't make them loose, but give them enough room to move so that you can take an investigation down a certain path. Because 25 years of being an investigator, they're not all the same, and there are some quirky ones out there that you can't actually follow the 1, 2, 3, 4 through to 10 process because of something that might come up. Anonymous complaints, they are difficult. You might get to, the first sentence in the complaint and go, I actually can't do anything with this because I don't know who reported it, I don't know anything about it, I can't qualify anything. Doesn't mean that you stop the investigation. It might be that you actually look at a group or look at an area in the business and understand, is that happening? Or look at the business holistically and say, well, is this a problem within the business itself? And then address it that way. Anonymous complaints might just be that it's a piece of a puzzle that you don't have yet, but who knows, in a month's time you might get another piece of the puzzle, and you might get another piece of the puzzle, and all of a sudden 3 anonymous complaints equals a portion of a complaint where you can say, right, okay, I can now have a look over here and identify what's going on. Never close them off and put them in the bottom drawer and say it's all done and finished. Sometimes, I know through my experience, people make anonymous complaints. I know they're throwing something out there and they're seeing if the business reacts. And it's usually a start of a process that someone's getting enough courage to then take that further. So take it that it might be the first step in the process for someone to come forward and actually, have the ability to do that. So an eligible recipient is an officer of senior manager, there you go, of a company or its related body corporate. Its auditor, Mr. Wright, you're in the hot seat, or actuary or a person authorised to receive disclosures, including an independent whistleblower service. So eligible recipient, senior manager, going back to what I said before, you've got to have the right person in the right place to make that report. And there's quite a few here. It's an individual is or has been an officer, an employee, an individual supplies services or goods. So you can read down that list there, and I think it answers a question from the front there before. Even got the relative, as well. So there's quite a number of people there that can be an eligible recipient, whistleblower, beg your pardon. And the whistleblower protection officer, this is what we were talking about before, about the senior management or the senior person in the business. Who are they? Could be the chief risk officer, someone in the leadership team. The role that we're concentrating on for the protection is the protecting, safeguarding disclosures and ensuring the integrity of the reporting mechanism. That's the person you've got to really look at. Are they able to do that? If they can't do that, then there's no point them being in that role. They can be a support person. I often say to my clients, don't use the word whistleblower protection officer. You can use that, but make it maybe a buddy system like they do in schools. Have it a confidant service where, you've nominated, 3 or 4 people in the leadership team. Their roles are to be a whistleblower protection officer, absolutely, but you might want to portray that a little bit softer in the workplace, because some people still have a real hard time being a whistleblower as opposed to, enlightening the business on something that's happened. So if you had a buddy system, that might be more approachable. Yes?
I would have thought that being a senior manager in an organisation, why is that you need to single out this particular organisation? I mean, like, it should be in your position of authority to protect your staff.
Because it doesn't always happen. It should. You're right. I agree with you. If you're at that level in the business, then you're there for a reason. You're there because you're respected, that you have the ability to ensure that not only people at a lower level than yourself, but even higher, because we're all people. People interact with people. You should be able to protect that person, but it doesn't happen all the time. So there's been lots of examples in the news that people are aware of that it just doesn't happen. NAB, Commonwealth Bank, all great companies, but there's people that just, for whatever reason, don't treat people with respect. So this is one of the reasons why they put legislation out, is to, butt people on the head and say, guys, come on, you've got to do this. You don't treat your family like that and your friends like that, so how can you treat work colleagues a different way? So
Andrew,
sure.
Sorry to be a pain, but
No.
the previous slide when you said answer my question, I think actually answered my question in the opposite.
Which one was that one? Sorry.
Yeah. And the reason I ask that is because the NFPs in this room, most of the things that we do is we help other people. So the organisation I'm on the board of provides social housing.
Yes.
My reading of that is that my social housing tenant is not one of those people. So if I'm Guide Dogs Victoria and I have one of the people who looks after dogs and wants to make a complaint, not one of those people.
So it does talk about employees, relatives, subcontractors. There's some other definitions, but they could be whistleblower, absolutely.
What about the associate? The tenant would be an associate of a social housing organisation.
An associate I would have thought would be someone who's related to the business that you run, so somebody who's an associate of me. Not somebody who's actually using my service.
But they could be. So where that falls into it, I do hear what you're saying. Believe me, it's not perfect. I understand that, but I know that associates, how people have been treated is the fact that, okay, how are you related to this business? In what capacity are you? I know with a lot of my clients are saying, well, that will cover you because it fits under the regime, it fits under the words and definition under the Act for misconduct.
I would argue, mainly because I don't want to have to implement this.
Have a look at the regulatory guide as well. And you know what, I will take that up. I know Mr. Day quite well, so I'll get back to you on that. If you give me an email address, I'll follow it up with Warren. I'll have a look at the regulatory guide and see what else they've got to offer as well.
I suppose the risk I'm thinking about here is that most of us are registered with the ACNC.
Yes.
At some stage, the ACNC is probably going to say, well, we'll extend the whistleblower protections to those organisations. My particular organisation would then be caught, but I'd be saying, well, actually, the nature of the people who I'm looking after are not actually in that list.
And that's where the legislation might change. They might say, right, okay, because of those anomalies, right, well, now this is what the word association means. But I've always taken it, how are you related to that business? Well, we'll just use Guide Dog for example. I'm one of the walkers, but I'm voluntary. Okay, well, what is it that we want to talk about? You might go through the process and go, well, actually, they are a whistleblower because, you know, there's been a misconduct issue here, you know, poor treatment of dogs, I don't know, I'm just making that story up. But it might be, well, actually, it is an issue. So this is where, you know, you'd work with a company and say, right, this has been brought to our attention, this is the issue. And so it sort of goes a bit beyond the Act in that respect, because you've got to have policies in place as well to protect them. So if it falls outside that, you've still got a duty of care. It's not perfect, I know. We'll agree to disagree.
I agree, but I don't. Obviously, the compliance aspect costs money.
Yep.
That's money you can't spend on the people that we help. So, from my perspective, if I don't have to spend the money, I want to help people.
I understand.
I can't do that. Yeah, I've got a trade-off if I don't do that.
I do understand. I do. But I'll send an email on. Yes.
I was just going to say, in relation to that, I mean, as an NFP, it's under ACNC, and part of all of us have to have a complaints procedure. So are we now sort of splitting hairs between a client who we have to, in that handbook, as soon as we're giving them services, there's a written complaints procedure if they have any issues, who to contact, how to do it and whatever, versus whistleblower, which is sort of that corporatised world, which should also have a complaints procedure. So, you know, that's where I'm sort of saying I don't need whistleblower protection. I don't know about housing mults, but I wish I had 50 mil, or 25 million assets, or 100 employees. So we don't fit those criteria anyway, but we've already got a complaints procedure in place.
Perfect. Because one of those complaints might be a misconduct, which might be whistleblower in that respect.
But that's what you're providing in the workplace.
Correct.
For us at the moment. Yeah.
That's right. And it might be that like I said at the start, most of the complaints that you receive fall way outside legislation, but they're still managed as if they fall inside the legislation, because what you're first presented with may not be seen as it is. It might be something else. So part of this, as I said, it's a brand new legislation, and I don't have any examples. I'm really sorry about what ASICs are doing, or are doing, or what's happening in relation to the new legislation. But I know it's going to be one of those trials that over the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, and then this will probably change again, as I said, especially when the new international standards come through in July 2021. So it's a massive work in progress for sure. So the key roles, how am I going there for time? I've only got like a couple of 10 minutes. There's plenty of other slides after this, so I'll finish up shortly. But as I said, you'll get all the slides anyway. And it's compelling reading too, the rest of it, I might add. So the Whistleblower Protection Officer, you've got to provide a term of reference that outlines the entity, if the entity determines that it will need to investigate a disclosure. And this is really important, the terms of reference, because some people get the terms of reference wrong, which makes, if you were writing the terms of reference, I would suggest that you have someone else look at it. Because if you get them wrong, sometimes it makes you guys investigating the matter a little bit difficult, because they've been presented with a letter which is not exactly correct, or there's a bit of a hole in the story that there's been an allegation made against them. So there's the four points that we like to cover off on: the nature and scope of the investigation, the person within or outside the entity that should lead the investigation, the nature of the technical, financial or legal advice that may be required to support the investigation, and the time frame. Regular feedback from people is really, really important, I think, too. I like to say to my clients, look, if you have a feedback not every day, you don't need feedback every day, but if you've got feedback every week, every fortnight, or when it's required after that point, it really helps manage that person's anxiety as well. And part of the regulatory guide and the legislation is people need feedback and closure. as well. So that helps them manage them through the process. And that sort of leads into the whistleblower investigation officer. Again, probably should be someone separate to a whistleblower protection officer, because there's two separate roles here. And as you'll read, you know, one's for protecting and providing that guardianship and support for the whistleblower or the person making the disclosure, and the other person is the person investigating it. I know it's a great thing to have a whole group of people doing different things, but realistically speaking, they're usually one and the same person. However, if you can separate the duties, then that's really good. And again, it has to be it's good to have a senior person in that role, because if someone's conducting an investigation, you know, they've got to have the ability to call someone to account and say, well, no, you need to come and speak to me because this is what the business has asked you to do. And this will be the last slide, I think, with the key roles, because I think we're going to go over time. So the key roles, the investigation report will be undertaken by the eligible recipient or delegated representative as required, depending on the matter or content of the material reported. So as I said there, you know, feedback's really important. Investigation outcomes, everyone needs to know an outcome. We may not necessarily provide a complete outcome because there might be certain parts of the investigation which is sensitive. People don't need to know the whole story, or they need to know that something's been put in place to minimise the risk of that reoccurring or prevent that from happening again. And at times the outcome of the investigation is not the result the whistleblower might be seeking, and it affirms the right to ultimately decide matters referred to formal investigations. Some people don't like the result, so some people might make complaints to get a different answer, go answer shopping. My advice is that, you know, the tail doesn't wag the dog. You know, at some stage, you know, you can look after the whistleblower, you've also got to look after the business as well. So if there's a business, as a business, these are the decisions that have been made, and they've been backed up with evidence and proper procedure, and the whistleblower doesn't like it, or the person making the complaint doesn't like it, there's probably something else you need to have a discussion about in respect to why they don't like the outcome. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot to digest. Look, I think the legislation's a work in progress. I think it's going to mature over time. As I said, I don't have any examples at the moment because there's nothing out there. All I can draw on is my experience. So, are there any other questions that people would like to ask? Yes. Yeah, go on.
It's very intangible to me, that's the thing. And my question is very much how you see the legislation being implemented. Because, yes, it's a good intention, but there's a few things that I can see practically it might not get there. One is not-for-profit organisation. We're very small. Some of them are very, very small. We probably don't have the resource to have all of the policy and the whistleblower guardianship or investigator, you know, in place. Or even when we have that person in place, do they have the time and the resource to do the investigation? And what if the investigation get to some point where they go, actually, the person that been investigated to is either the CEO or the board member or something, where would that go? You see what I mean? I can't see the answer to the good intention.
Good group of questions there. Yes, and it's look, as I said, it's sometimes difficult. In respect to your point about not having the resources, yes, it's always going to be a problem. It's always going to be there. If you can reach out to a trusted source and go, hey, what do I do here? That's a really good start. Part of what I'm doing here today is I've actually got a whistleblower policy that, insert name here, you take away, have it for yourself. So for people that don't have the resourcing, can't afford the whatever it costs to write a policy, I'm quite happy, well, sharing it with you guys anyway, so you can take that away. You can even look at it against your own policy and say, well, how does that stack up with mine? It was written very, very closely to the regulatory guide, So if you look at that, you can say, right, oh, that's where that paragraph come from, things like that. And that's why ASIC did it, to say, okay, people that don't have the resources, how do I get that implemented? It's always going to be an issue. Monetary-wise, people, resource-wise, absolutely. But I suppose you're already managing people with complaints at the moment. So, you know what? If you stand back and look, okay, well, this story come up, how did we do this? So it's not indifferent. What it's doing is just pointing people to the fact that there will be repercussions. If there's a whistleblower that fits under the Act, this is the way it must be treated. And look, I know, and not knowing you, you would have something in front of you that you don't go and generally talk to other people about. This is just telling you in the Act that you're not allowed to, and these are reasons why you can't, and if you do, so you'd have all those same precautions anyway. This just makes it more pointed. So I think you'll find that you're resourced in some respects for the current management of complaints that you may or may not have now. Does that make sense? I know I sort of went a roundabout way, but it's always going to be a problem. I get faced with that all the time. Andrew, how are we going to do this? My advice to my guys is ring me, ask the dumb question. Di and I can answer the question. We'll help you, point you in the right direction. So at least at the start, you're going down the right pathway instead of following off this way and go, oopsie daisy, we should have gone back this way. So just pick up the phone and ask. Thank you very much. I hope it was interesting for you. As I said, I've got another slideshow with like 60-something slides in it that will give you a lot more information, a lot more detail. I just knew we didn't have enough time to go through it today, so I did a bit of a skip and jump across them, but you'll get them after this. All right? Thank you very much for listening.